A very good morning and a very good evening. Um, I'm Anne Tay. I'm the Global Director for Young China Watchers. I'm sitting here in Singapore, and I'm very delighted to have Victor Shih, who's sitting in San Diego, joining us today. Just a very quick introduction of Young China Watchers for those of you who may not be familiar. We're a very large network of China-focused young professionals. We were in a different time, located in 10 different cities across Asia, Europe, and the United States. But the very small silver lining of COVID has resulted us in conducting fantastic and active webinars that have been able to cut through across regions and across continents. So I'm very, very pleased that all our friends, our YCW friends are able to join us all across Asia as well as the US. So um, before I introduce Victor, oops, sorry. Before I introduce Victor, I just like to just mention a bit of housekeeping, which is, unfortunately, we have to mute everyone just because we have so many people joining us, and just to preserve a bit of bandwidth. We're going to receive questions via chat, and so if you have a question, please send it to everyone. So I have two colleagues, Raf and Sam, who are going to be kind of checking to make sure we don't miss anybody. We had a small glitch where we sent out a registration link, and so you're showing up perhaps not in your own name. So if you could just take the liberty to please rename yourself if you realize that the name showing up is not you. We have about, I think, 30 people having the same name at the moment. All right, okay, great. So I'm very pleased again to welcome Victor. Victor is an associate professor of political economy at UC San Diego. He's the Homi Lam Chair in China and Pacific Relations. For those of you who have been following Victor's work, you know that he has published widely on the politics of Chinese banking policies, fiscal policies, and exchange rates. I have been following Victor's work since I graduated, and not to give myself away, that was quite a long time. So I'm very glad to have seen Victor last year in February when we were all able to travel, and I'm delighted to have him join us again here. So Victor, just to kick things off, we were supposed to discuss Liang Hui today, but given the fast and furious policies and pronouncements coming out, both from the US and China, I think we're going to be a very, very busy hour and a bit. So why don't we start off with something simple? Top 3 significant takeaways from Liang Hui as we get into it. Over to you.
First of all, thank you, Sue-Ann, Raphael, and Sam for inviting me. It's a real honor to be speaking to this group finally, I would say. And I've long heard of all the interesting activities that you guys have done, and I'm very happy to take part in it. First of all, just a very quick note about my institution. It's the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego, and we have a master's degree in China Studies. It's called the MCPA program, where you can come and learn from the likes of Barry Naughton, myself, Wei Yishi, and others. So, and Taiming Zheng, who's an expert in China security policy. Anyway, back to your question. The 3 major take-homes for me, I mean, to me, 3 things really stuck out to me of the NPC sessions. And I'll talk about the more, I guess, trivial ones before we talk about Hong Kong, I guess, that being the most serious issue. The first one is economic policies. The first 2 are really just economic observations. So the first one is that obviously the NPC did not announce a growth target. It did announce a deficit target that was substantially higher than in previous years. But if you look at where the deficit spending of the Chinese government this year is going to be targeted at, it's not going to be a massive stimulus, nor is it going to be contrary to what the US, what Europe have done, which is more of a demand side stimulus. China will not have a demand side stimulus. And last night, actually, we had a really interesting Zoom call with a bunch of Chinese economists, and they confirmed that indeed that what China is doing is not going to the demand side stimulus. There will not be $600 checks, you know, every week going to 600 renminbi, let's say, checks going to unemployed Chinese people. Instead, it will be a supply side focus mini stimulus, still a few trillion renminbi, that is especially focused on tech investment. So one part of it will be focused on tech investment in trying to get China to catch up further in IT technologies, even though China already is sort of ahead of the curve in terms of 5G, but potentially a lot of that money plowing into chip production, chip research and development, which is currently a weaker link in China's industrial policies. The problem with that is that if you look at the income and consumption numbers, both in the US and in China, and also in Europe and Japan, is that we're seeing household income falling across the board in all of these continents. And even where income is not falling, like in the US in April, actually income did increase a little bit on average just because of the stimulus checks that our capitalist government has given to the poor households in the US. Consumption has declined pretty significantly by 14% in April. And so the demand for Chinese produced goods is going to weaken regardless, but nonetheless, China is pushing ahead in resuming production across as many factories as possible. So there's a whole range of fiscal incentives to get the factories to start producing. That means the whole world is going to be flooded with cheap Chinese goods, which will be made even cheaper with the recent devaluation of the renminbi, which of course affects not just the US-China trade balance, but also China's trade balance with the entire world. So in essence, I mean, right now, China's strategy is literally exporting deflation. And China is exporting deflation in an environment where the whole world is already facing huge deflationary pressure because of COVID-19. So I think that has implication not just in the relationship between U.S. and China, but also the trade balance between China and Japan, China and Europe, China and India, China and Southeast Asia, et cetera, et cetera. Within China, my second observation is that within China, the deficit is going to get worse, and that's in a sense expected. But the fiscal situation at the local level, so below the central level, was already extremely poor. And this year, if you look at the first 3 months of this year, local level fiscal revenue just collapsed, basically. I think the decline was like 30 or 40% in fiscal income. Expenditure also fell to some extent a little bit because most government functions were shut down, except for the essential ones. The central government has rolled out some policies, to try to guarantee the income of civil servants at the local level. I mean, but if you think about it, the fact that they need to have a policy like that means that a lot of civil servants at the local level were not getting paid what they were supposed to be paid from January to March. And the central government is catching up in this respect to try to get them paid. So certainly it's really not good. And again, some of the economists that we talked to last night confirmed this to be the case, that at the local level, the fiscal balance and the fiscal expenditure is really not in great shape. There is now some transfer payments. The central government is leaving behind some of the tax revenue that in previous year they would have collected for central expenditure. They're leaving some of this tax revenue at the local level in order to meet very basic salaries, right? So all this previously office expenditures, building new buildings, bonuses, and so on and so forth, I expect a lot of that to go away at the local level. So you're going to have some pretty unhappy civil servants in China for this year, at least, if not going into next year, especially if demand for Chinese goods around the world do not pick up, which I don't expect it to pick up, right? This is a huge economic shock. And if China is not going to stimulate domestic demand, global demand for Chinese goods also will be weak. And so, even if production were to resume across the board, demand for Chinese goods will be a lot weaker across the board. And one thing that I find very strange is that, so Li Keqiang yesterday disclosed publicly that there are 600 million Chinese, so close to half the population of China, with income of 1,000 renminbi or less. In an era of food inflation, 1,000 renminbi really doesn't go that far. And so an obvious way to stimulate demand for Chinese goods is to just massively give money to Chinese people, to Chinese households, so that they can spend money and buy more of the goods that are produced in China in a time when global demand for Chinese goods is also falling pretty steeply. But that is not going to be the policies of the Chinese government. And I think this is going to be a problem for the whole world. Okay, so finally, let's talk a little bit about Hong Kong. It's very bad. It's as bad as most of us had feared. Although what I would say is that, like my parents, the reason why my family immigrated to the United States in 1986 was because my parents had anticipated this to happen in 1997. Instead, it didn't happen until 2020. So at least it didn't happen right away. It happened 2 decades later, but the worst thing is happening. Essentially, my interpretation of the NPC law on Hong Kong, on enforcing national security in Hong Kong, is several-fold. One is that it's very wide-ranging, so a whole range of activities, subverting or overthrowing state authorities, splitism, terrorism, any acts, and I assume, the sort of definition of act in this case will be very wide-ranging, including speech. So speech or writing, or certainly, protests, riots, acts of terrorism, which are related to these three things, subverting or overthrowing state authorities, splitism, and terrorism, will be deemed illegal under this law. But how is the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government is going to make this a reality? This is, in a way, the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part is that the law empowers agencies in mainland China, including the Ministry of State Security and also the Ministry of Public Security, and potentially, the Intelligence Bureau, whatever it's called these days, of the People's Liberation Army, to set up openly offices. I mean, I believe these agencies already have offices in Hong Kong, but at least they're sort of hidden. But now they can have open offices and have officers that act openly in Hong Kong, presumably with some judiciary power, right? So this is not going to be the case where they, kind of like the special branch of the old days, where they just get the intelligence on certain activities, report it to the Hong Kong police and go and arrest these people. That's sort of the UK system. It sounds like that these agencies will have their own power to arrest people. The most disturbing possibility, but I think it's, we have to give it at least 50% probability, is that these agencies can arrest people and also to extradite them to mainland China for trial, for so-called trial, and sentencing. If that were to happen, then there would be just a reign of terror in Hong Kong for a broad range of Hong Kong's population. I mean, you have to remember this anti-extradition protests and the Yellow Umbrella protests previously involved 1/6 to 1/5 of Hong Kong's population, over 1 million people. So a lot of people are very sympathetic. A lot of people have expressed their opinions online about these kinds of issues. All of that can be interpreted as a subversion of state power, if not some of the other charges. Also within the Hong Kong government, they are now compelled to effectively stop these behavior, right? Whatever effectively means. And effectively could mean, having Chinese national judges adjudicate over national security related cases. So that's one of the possibilities being discussed. Also, there was wording in the NPC law on national security education. So that means that sort of they will ram through this patriotic education curriculum in the schools of Hong Kong, almost certainly. They will try to do that. So basically, when all of these laws, both in Hong Kong, also at the NPC and basic law level, so there will be changes sort of across the board in all of these legal regimes. A year from now, I really expect Hong Kong to be a very, very different place than it is today. And I think this will have enormous implications, not only for civil society in Hong Kong. I mean, civil society in Hong Kong will come under enormous pressure or worse, but also for investors, right? So, subverting state power, what does that mean? Like, can Muddy Water still do a lot of research, trying to short Chinese companies? Can investors who have bought into the bonds, and there are hundreds of billions of bonds issued by SOEs and state banks every year in Hong Kong, what if there's a default? Can they sue these companies in a Hong Kong court? Will they have recourse, or would that be classified as a subversion of state authorities? But if they can't, then basically there would be no investors' protection, just like how investors are treated when they purchase mainland Chinese issued securities, right? So there are some investors that are still interested in buying bonds and stocks onshore, but certainly the number is a lot smaller. The amount is also smaller because investors know they have no recourse ultimately in mainland China. And now that could be the case when they purchase securities that have been issued in Hong Kong. Also, with such powerful security agencies operating in Hong Kong, all the regulators of Hong Kong will be afraid of these authorities. Right, so the HKMA, the Hong Kong securities regulators will be afraid of these agencies operating in Hong Kong with wide-ranging national security power, and will put investors' rights definitely as a second or third or fourth priority compared to the demands of these key agencies. So I think these are the things that will fundamentally change the investment environment in Hong Kong. And certainly for civil society, it will be quite dark 1 year from now. Anyway, those are my 3 observations.
Thanks, Victor. Lots to pick up on. So I'm going to kick off with 1 or 2 questions, but just very quick on housekeeping. We're getting a lot of messages and saying, why am I being called Fred Tsai on this channel? Just, you have the ability to rename yourself. So look for yourself in the gallery view. Under me, I think you're probably sitting next to Victor on your own screens, and you can rename yourself. In any case, any questions you may have, just self-identify and yourself and your affiliation. So let's get the questions coming in, but I had 1 or 2 for Victor. One is lots of questions on Hong Kong, but I wanted to go back a little bit on what is largely supply side stimulus, as you have mentioned, going into biotech. It seems that the priority and attention on that is not abating. But I suppose the question is, are there any blind spots then? I mean, interesting that you say no stimulus checks, surprisingly, for the mass population, and revenue tightening at the local level. That's always very tough. Tough that you're trying to meet targets that are being set on employment, and yet not having enough budget. Will there be dissatisfaction at the local level? But then how does this then travel up to the elites, which is a very core supporting layer for Xi Jinping? So any blind spots we should be watching out for?
Well, it's not a perfect solution what the Chinese government is doing. That it will cause pain for a large swaths of the population, in the sense that basically the current strategy is, if you're a college graduate, you can't get a job. There will be an unpaid internship for you, or you can, admissions to graduate programs is a lot looser now today, but you still have to pay for it. So if your parents have some money, then they can pay for you can always like study overseas at, at UCSD or other institutions. Or you can kind of go to the countryside and get some kind of very low level government jobs. So I think there is this kind of jobs program, so to speak, but the pay is really poor, and you're going to go to some very undesirable locations. So the goal is to prevent the worst, right? So if you look at a whole range of policies, they're aimed at preventing the worst outcomes for the majority of the population. It's like, well, if people don't starve, if people have a roof over their head, if people have some semblance of a job, they're going to be happy. Like, they're going to be fine. The problem, of course, is in the short term, that is fine. But if, as I fear that this is going to be a prolonged global recession, the weakness in global demand, the weakness of foreign invested enterprises production, the weakness of even Chinese companies' production in China will continue for years to come, then these temporary measures are not going to be effective in the medium term, right? So after a year or two, if a college student is still at a dead-end job or not really having real employment, they're going to be very unhappy. So I guess the regime, of course, probably anticipate this to some extent, but I think what they're thinking is that the control over social media, the repressive apparatus, the surveillance are good enough so that even when a sizable number of people are unhappy, they start to post negative things online, it's going to be censored. They can identify the people who are really, really unhappy and arrest them. But one implication of that is that they will have to arrest a large number of people in mainland China if the economic recession continues for another year. I mean, for now, I think people are sort of okay and they're willing to wait and see how bad things get. But 1 year from now, if the economy is still not picking up, I think the central government will have to think more about a demand side stimulus. But they do have some capacity to do that, actually. So. Oh, I can't hear you, Sue.
Just to, I think, on a follow-up question we have from Andrew Collier, and are we also seeing infrastructure spending through local government bonds and private capital, along with the focus on tech?
So if you look at the muni bond issuance, has picked up, but not like a huge amount so far. So I just looked up the April data just before I went on. LGFV, so all corporate related issuance has also picked up. I think it's like 800 billion to 1 trillion increase in the first 4 months, which is significant but not massive. So I think the way that I understand the stimulus investment money is that there will be some going toward infrastructure. A lot of it is planned already. They're just accelerating. It's like, for example, like the Great Bay Area, they're going to build like a tunnel next to this bridge that already exists that connects, Hong Kong with Zhuhai. There's going to be some kind of tunnel also. There'll be extra airports in a few cities, even though no one's flying, that kind of stuff. But then a third to a half of the new investment money will be geared toward technology. But of course, as you know, some of the so-called tech money will also be used for infrastructure, because you need your biotech city, you need your whatever this dream cities for this and that tech. But nonetheless, the scale is not that huge relative to the 100 trillion renminbi size economy of China.
Thanks, Victor. There are a couple of Hong Kong questions. I'm going to cluster a little bit as best as I can. One is from Yidan Lee. Yidan asked, one potential U.S. punitive sanction is to restrict HKMA access to the Fed facility, which would spell the end of the Hong Kong dollar peg. And it obviously hurt U.S. businesses as well as Chinese and Hong Kong interests. I think it'd be hurt a lot of people. Do you think this scenario is likely? And then in relation to the Hong Kong issue, in an interview with Michael Barboza, Steve Bannon, so it's The Wire, right? I believe that.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. I was making news around on Twitter. Steve Bannon offered a series of very extreme measures and actions the US should take in response to China and Hong Kong, one of which is freezing assets of Chinese Politburo leaders and state-owned banks, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen versions of this floating around. What's your take on that position? So 2 questions.
So the swaps between HKMA and the Fed, it depends on how much of it HKMA has used, and I haven't seen the data, but I suspect it's not that much so far, just because the HKMA nominally has like $300 billion, $400 billion on its reserve. But the question is, how much of that reserves are real? So and that maybe Sue-Ann has some insight on. I believe there are all these swaps that are happening that both the PBOC and HKMA have done. And I think almost certainly the HKMA did swaps with the PBOC and basically created Hong Kong dollar to give to the PBOC so the PBOC can get some of it and claim it as FX reserve or something like that. Who knows, right? And also, as an entity holding all these U.S. treasuries, the HKMA might be able to swap those or repo those bonds, U.S. treasuries that they hold, maybe even with private counterparties for cash. So something like that. So I think the larger issue is that China has increased its international borrowing through Hong Kong to a tremendous degree since 2015. So by my calculation, the increase in borrowing since 2015, which in total was at $1 trillion US dollars, probably 60 to 70% of that went through Hong Kong. And Hong Kong became a place where China has borrowed a lot of additional dollars. Well, why does China need to borrow all this money? And indeed, that's very puzzling because China runs a current account surplus. So in theory, it doesn't need to borrow any money. In fact, it should be a net provider of capital to the rest of the world. And indeed, it does lend a lot of money to the rest of the world, through One Belt, One Road projects, etc. But it turns out that much of the money for One Belt, One Road comes from Chinese borrowing from international financial institutions, mainly private financial institutions globally. And the way that it works is interbank channels. So to me, the central bank swaps between HKMA and the Fed is not nearly as important as Hong Kong domiciled banks borrowing in the international interbank market in huge amounts, which you can say, well, what can you do with that market? And my response is that, you should do nothing, because if you try to shut it down overnight, then, all hell breaks loose. You will have a global financial crisis immediately. But should the banks of the world have a conversation in terms of how big their total exposure to China should be, I think there should be a conversation like that, right? Because China ultimately is still an EM country, but the way that it's borrowing is truly massive, right? So by my calculation, if you include Hong Kong and mainland China together, China has borrowed a net of $2.6 trillion from the rest of the world as of the beginning of this year of 2020. It is often claimed that China has a lot of international asset also to offset the liabilities that they have. But if you look at their assets, a lot of it, of course, in the reserve is U.S. Treasuries, but a lot of it is just Hong Kong-based assets, which I think should not count because, you know, after all, Hong Kong is a part of China, right? As was forcefully asserted. So once you net out the Hong Kong stuff, you net out the Macau stuff, you net out, you know, maybe some of the Singaporean stuff, which is just Chinese companies lending to each other, basically. You really don't, my contention is you really don't have a lot of true international assets. And the stuff that you do have are really loans to developing countries that have no ability of repaying them. And if that's the case, should banks around the world continue to lend to Chinese entities? And I think the level right now is sort of reasonable, you know, 2.6 trillion, but if China wanted to go up to 3.6 trillion, $4 trillion, should there be some kind of limit or constraint on that? I think a conversation on that is worthwhile.
I think that's a very interesting question. It's obviously something that both sides need to look into, at least on, you know, the international banks and FI side. What is the true extent of exposure to China? It is very true. It tends to be very layered through interbank lending, which I don't think we all have very open and easy understanding and access to. But on the other side, I wanted to ask is, you know, based on your conversations with, say, PBOC officials, surely they've anticipated this, even if not with you know, the suggestions of limited access, but surely they have anticipated that what it would be if they were cut off even through via Hong Kong, for example. HKMA and PBOC do have the swap currency agreements. It's the RMB one. That one's always fully tapped out, and then they renew them again. But have you heard anything from PBOC, like unofficially, you know, what the concerns are around exposure? Well, I suppose the more important question is, do they truly understand their own exposure internationally?
I think they do. And, you know, so I don't have any like recent insights, but one thing that I know from 2015 was that the PBOC increased their borrowing from the rest of the world through Hong Kong because they had to. So the higher ups, you know, whether it be Liu He or Xi Jinping himself, saw the collapse of China's foreign exchange reserve and basically ordered the technocrats and the PBOC to reverse that. You know, to do whatever it takes, make sure we have $3 trillion or whatever the amount. And the PBOC, you know, scrambled around. It's like, well, what can we do to possibly make it happen? And the one thing that they came up with, which works immediately, was to increase borrowing by a huge amount, especially through Hong Kong, right, as the data reveal. And so that's what they did. In the past few months, what you've seen is that there has been repayment of some of this international liability. So the growth rates of China's external borrowing, you know, if you look at the BIS data, has slowed. But to me, I think for them to repay even a significant portion of that would be extremely difficult going forward, because you know, the entities that have conducted the borrowing are either highly illiquid or they wouldn't want to repay them, right? So like for China Development Bank, for example, right? So they've issued a huge amount of bonds, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars in bonds internationally to finance One Belt, One Road projects, but the debtors for those projects in the middle of a global recession cannot possibly repay those debts. And so where is China Development Bank and Exim Bank of China going to get the money to repay international creditors? They cannot, right? So they can only roll these debt forward, you know, capitalize the interest payments in some cases. And so this debt is going to increase slowly, right? So even if they get rolled over and over again, a lot of the interbank loans, you know, is in the similar situation. Some of the large industrial SOEs may be able to repay their debt, you know, if there are net earners internationally. So if within the firm they run a current account surplus, then maybe they can repay some of it. But again, some of the large commodities ones, you know, they're mainly importers, so they, you know, where are they going to get the dollars to repay their debt? So this is the problem. So I don't think the external debt will decrease. And if there's another bout of capital flight, which there might be, as people in Hong Kong, i.e. Chinese investors, pull out the money from Hong Kong, which may create a suction effect that pulls money out of China, mainland China also, into Hong Kong or further afield, can the PBOC do the same trick again and borrow massively overseas to counteract the outflows? And even if they can, whether that's desirable for the rest of the world, I think, there needs to be a conversation. You're muted yet again.
Sorry, you think I learned. Just very, very quickly on the debt issue, and then let's jump back to speculating what further actions to come out from US and China. Somebody asked about, oh yes, so CBD and MOFCOM put out a policy to support distressed so-called high-quality BRI projects. Any developments on that front? And then, there's obviously all that chatter about debt forgiveness for emerging economies. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's going to bode well, given your explanation of potential capital flight. And I'll stop there. But yes.
Yeah, so I think that's a very tricky issue for the Chinese government going forward. It's because, of course, if the loan is denominated in renminbi, right? So if these One Belt, One Road loans are denominated in renminbi, no problem. I mean, the PBOC can always print more money. They can forgive those debt, no problem. But my understanding is that the vast majority of these loans are not denominated in renminbi. They're denominated in USD or some other foreign currency. As such, this creates a huge problem for the Chinese monetary authorities, because if they forgive those loans, they still have to repay their international creditors who lend Chinese banks the money in the first place to lend to these BRI entities. And there will be no cash flows with which to do that, except from the foreign exchange reserve, which they don't want to do because that depletes the foreign exchange reserve, or with additional borrowing from the rest of the world. So these are the only two sources of foreign currency, really, because when you're like, well, wait a minute, what about current account surpluses? Well, the mystery of China's trade is that despite the fact that China runs like these 30, 40 billion per month trade surplus, the money does not show up in China at all, right? So if you look at the safe data on the flows of money into and out of China, money is not showing up, or is showing up in a much smaller scale than the actual trade surplus. There's a variety of reasons for that, but I think the main reason is because a lot of exporters, they don't want to leave the money in mainland China, and so they try to get paid offshore as much as possible. And this tendency is even stronger today because of the devaluation that we've seen recently of the renminbi. So the only two sources of money, if they forgive debt, is from safe or from additional borrowing, and neither channel is really that desirable for the Chinese government these days. So the best they can do is what they do in China, which is to pretend the loan is still in good shape and keep on rolling it over. But the rolling over, the problem is that if they get rolled over, they're not actually generating interest income for the Chinese banks that lend the money in the first place. So there's still net negative cash flows, right? Because the Chinese banks, they still have to pay interest to the foreign creditors, but at the same time, they're not receiving cash flows from their own debtors. And so basically, in the overall balance of payment, somehow the Chinese government will have to find the FX net inflows to subsidize this net outflows that's happening in the financial account.
Thanks, Victor. So a bit concerning, definitely, especially given the margin compression environment that we're in, not to mention negative rates. So I just wanted to jump back. I think someone had posed that Sam German had posed a question about more extreme measures that the U.S. could possibly take in response to China and Hong Kong. I mean, he quoted Steve Bannon. I can't imagine how extreme they are. But I think a bunch of other questions are asking, a bunch of other questions that were rolling in. One from Alan Wan about, I think one, obviously, what further actions and sanctions possibly can the US come up with? And then on the Chinese side, what kind of retaliatory measures can the Chinese come up with in response to, expelling, military-linked students from China? So from the US and China, any idea of what may possibly come down the line? And I suppose more importantly, what can really hurt? What can each side implement a measure that could really, really hurt each other?
Okay, what really hurts? So the students and exchanges and that kind of stuff, it's already very asymmetric. China already had all kinds of restrictions in terms of, what people from the United States or from the rest of the world could travel to China. Obviously anyone involved with civil society that's friendly to, these sensitive topics, like Tibet, Xinjiang, and now I guess they'll just add Hong Kong to it. Anyone, maybe including professors like myself, who is seen as being friendly to the cause in Hong Kong won't be able to travel to mainland China anymore. Too bad, but whatever. No. I want to go back to mainland China, please. I mean, I do want to go back to mainland China. So that's one potential consequence, but that's is small in the grand scheme of things. So I do have to say that this restriction that's been placed on granting visas to Chinese students, especially those graduating from any universities linked to the People's Liberation Army, likely is very, very counterproductive. Just because I think, the principle in the United States should be innocent until proven guilty, right? So we do have due process in this country, supposedly, and this flies in the face of it. This is presuming that anyone with those affiliations must be guilty of trying to steal technology. I think it's much more appropriate to ramp up the degree of surveillance, however the US government does this kind of stuff, and sort of catch people in the act, right? And that's more in line with the due process that we have in this country. So I do hope that that kind of policy does not, proliferate, to like, oh, well, any university involved with military civil fusion can't come to the United States. Well, that includes, Tsinghua University, that includes some of the best universities where in the US and also in the UK, and especially also Singapore, are getting the best graduate students from these kinds of universities. Tsinghua, science and technology universities, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a very bad policy.
It's very broad a category. I mean, how do you define, military and civil fusion?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so there are certain universities that are historically, at least, heavily operated by the People's Liberation Army. So I think those are the universities currently being targeted, which I said is bad, but not as bad as if they escalate to the next step of any universities involved in civil military fusion projects, which, basically all the top universities of China have been going after this kind of state money, right? So it's basically like NSF money in the US is very attractive. And reality is these days, there's just a lot of dual use technologies, and you really can't get away from it if you do serious science research. At least you can't get, besides medical sciences, really, you can't go that far from it. So that's the reality, that there just will be some technology leakage. And I think the United States sort of has to accept that. In terms of what is the really bad things that can hurt, I mean, I try not to think too much about that. But one thing that China can do, which can really hurt the United States, is that China has cornered the market on crucial components on a large number of industrial goods. And there was some discussion on like, well, why don't we just stop, exporting, certain engine parts that you need to make a GM car, certain components that you need to build, some machine that's widely used in the US, and that will basically halt the production of these cars or machines completely, right, in the US. But that proposal was vetoed in China because these economists you talk to, they were, well, that will just really hurt the Chinese economy, and also that will facilitate the decoupling of the US and Chinese economies, and that's highly undesirable, and so on and so forth. So that argument won the day. Would they revisit the issue again? For a small number of products, they might revisit that issue, right? So I don't know, but there must be, so those of you who know this better than me, like there must be one or two components that China produce that if they stop exporting those components to the US would probably stop a large number of production in the US, and those might be the components that China targets.
I think it was sorry, I think it was lithium. Do you remember this debate a while back about the contribution of lithium across many products, including electric vehicles? I forgot when that was specifically.
It could be lithium. It could be, some people said rare earth, but then the US now has a huge stockpile of rare earth and all this stuff. I don't know. So I don't know. So I don't know the industrial side as well. So that's one thing that China could use potentially, but then that definitely will facilitate decoupling. And ultimately, I think China will not so much resort to that, because if you look at the export numbers, especially export of industrial goods, despite years of One Belt, One Road policies, and despite, Professor Justin Lin's initial hope that Latin America and Africa demand for Chinese goods will replace the demand from North America, it has not happened, and certainly it will not happen in the foreseeable future, given the global economy, right? So because at the end of the day, like, let's take the case of Latin America, most of these countries remain raw material exporters, and if the whole world is not doing well, the economies of those countries also will not do well. And in fact, they may do exceptionally badly. And so China will not be able to sell more stuff to those countries in Latin America. They won't be able to sell more stuff to the countries in Africa, and they will still be reliant on the North American market. Even a weaker North American market is still a lot bigger than the African market, for example. And so I think with the exception of one or two key components, there will not be a wide-ranging export ban to the United States. What can the US do? We've seen probably the worst thing that we could do already, this chip kind of, export ban to Huawei. Higher tariffs, that's always but higher tariffs of course will hurt US companies that are using Chinese components. I mean, one thing that people don't realize is that if you were going to decouple, the time to do it would have been 15 years ago, before China made literally everything in the industrial space. But nowadays, everything has changed. Most countries just don't have the capacity to produce, to have the supply chain, especially for a wide range of components necessary for some of these machines. And so, I think this dependence on China's production can only be changed at extremely high costs, which of course will make the whole world's economies less efficient and highly undesirable, and so on and so forth. Besides the tariffs and trade, I think really the interbank lending needs to be looked at. And again, I don't think it's desirable to say, oh, we're going to treat China just like Iran and stop all forms of lending to Chinese. I mean, China has borrowed 2.6 trillion. I mean, if you cut everything off immediately, you will immediately have a global financial crisis, which is certainly not what the world needs in the middle of a pandemic already. But whether there should be a conversation on putting a ceiling on how much China can borrow globally, I think from a purely financial and risk management perspective, it is a worthwhile conversation.
I think that's a good action to kind of take away in terms of what we really need to look at, which I suppose it goes back to understanding the real exposure China has internationally. But I think I think most people generally agree that kind of hurting each other through tariffs or financial sanctions, well, I mean curbs on lending, is not going to be very helpful. You're going to end up hurting a lot more people. And this obviously phase one of the trade deal that we're still seeing kind of working itself out. But I think someone mentioned about, as I mentioned, Russia, Iranian style sanctions on individuals, right? So I think this has come up before around Xinjiang and, possibly Hong Kong, banning people from entering China, considering how many of the elites have children studying and living in the US. I think that can hurt people, not just politicians, but, just a very mobile and wealthy upper middle class in China. What about that?
Yeah, that can be done. There'll be retaliation, of course. Then, all the members of Congress who sponsor, the Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act, which basically the entire Congress will face similar sanctions, and some of them own businesses and so on and so forth. I think for the case of Xinjiang, it's justifiable because it is a gross violation of human rights. That, if the culprits were put on trial in the International Court of Justice, some of them would be found guilty. In the case of Hong Kong, so far, maybe I'm too blasé about this. I don't think it's so bad so far, but only in the context that it's going to get a lot worse, right? So if we do begin to see Xinjiang-style policies being enacted in Hong Kong, then I think that then it would be much more justifiable. So I guess, putting some of these laws in place for now is reasonable in case things get as bad as Xinjiang. But I think that would be kind of my threshold, right? So, if a more moderate scenario were to emerge, where the Ministry of State Security is active in Hong Kong, but they are referring the actual arrests to the Hong Kong police, and the arrested people still go through due process, and if foreign judges were still allowed to adjudicate over all of these cases, then I think the ground for imposing sanctions on individuals is not so strong, just because even though the means of investigation has changed, at least there's still due process, in a fairly open manner. But if the worst fear is my worst fear is materialized, and that MSS can operate freely in Hong Kong, extradite people into China, extradite a large number of people to China, then I think the grounds for using mass violation of human rights to sanction individual officials would be more justifiable.
Okay, we've got more questions coming in. We're going to take a few more questions. And I'm trying to combine them a little bit just to make it easier. I am obliged to remind everyone that this call is actually recorded. Our able global editor is on the line. He's going to kind of whip up something wonderful off this chat. If anyone has any issues with this, you can message me privately. But the thing is, because we don't have actually the audience raising questions or anything, but any problems, please let us know. Okay, one, which is inevitable. What is the thinking behind the current aggressive wolf warrior foreign relations strategy, especially as the world is becoming less enamored with China as a result of COVID? Does the aggression tell us more about the pressure inside China? And then another one of our members then raises in relation, which is, can you talk a little bit about political calculations among different factions in Beijing right now as a result of external pressure? To correlate it here.
Okay, so these are good questions. So the wolf warrior phenomenon, where does it come from? I think this is one of the signs of an emerging Xi Jinping dictatorship. In that, now that he is unquestionably the most powerful politician in the Chinese Communist Party, people, officials, especially those in the middle strata, stratum of the Chinese government, kind of your 司长, 副部长 type people, really has a high incentive to exaggerate their compliance with the wishes of Xi Jinping. And I believe it was Xi Jinping who first mentioned that, China is stronger now. We should have a stronger voice, right? So this 话语权 becomes extremely important. And so what you saw then was a whole bunch of diplomats and some of the scholars and so on and so forth. And, Hu Xijin, my favorite comic personality, if you will, jumping in reaction and condemning any kind of foreign behavior that seems against the interests of China or against Chinese policies in quite extreme terms, right? So, the vitriolics that is being targeting foreign officials, foreign civil society, foreign academics has certainly intensified. And the reason is because with Xi Jinping being unquestionably the most powerful person in China, and with him having pretty nationalist preferences, I think we can surmise that from everything that he's done so far, people will have an incentive to really play to his preference in order to attract his attention. And the reason for that is because he's the only one who can promote people to a high level, right? From the mid-level to the high level. So from the director general level to vice ministerial to full ministerial level, I believe most of these appointments now require the personal sign-off of Xi Jinping himself. And so as such, it really motivates people to try to get his attention in order to get that promotion. And this is, so the domestic flip side of that is the anti-poverty thing, right? So as you know, Xi Jinping has really put a heavy emphasis on this anti-poverty campaign, even though by all accounts that I've heard that it's a complete farce, it completely doesn't work. Just sending a bunch of Beijing bureaucrats to the middle of nowhere to solve the poverty issue, it doesn't do anything, right? I mean, like maybe they build a new toilet or something like that, but it actually does not resolve the long-term issue of poverty, which is very complex, right? So it has, and ultimately requires huge expenditure from the central government to provide rural public goods, but the central government is not going to do that, as we know. But nonetheless, you see a lot of mid-level officials really go out of the way to say, I am going to spend 3 months, in the middle of nowhere in Gansu and help these people out with anti-poverty, and, talk to every single domestic reporter they can find about, the lengths to which they go to help with anti-poverty. But really the function is the same thing. They're trying to get the attention of Xi Jinping to show how much they're willing to fully comply with the wishes of Xi Jinping in order to increase the chance of getting a promotion, right? And so this is very related to the second question about factions. So I think most of the rival factions, if you will, of Xi Jinping have all gone away or are now basically marginalized. I think the Youth League is still a real faction. They're still there, but their officials are not doing very well. They're not getting the kinds of promotions that will ultimately bring them into the Politburo Standing Committee. Officials like Liu Hao, who was very promising, did not get into the Politburo, even though he was on his way there. So basically, you have people who are very close to Xi Jinping because they've worked together in the past, or they're fellow princelings. Outside of that, you really don't have very organized factions anymore, besides the Youth League again, right? So, but if you're not in the Youth League, you're not, in Xi Jinping's faction, all you're really trying to do is to get his attention by over-complying, if you will, to some of the policy demands that Xi Jinping is paying attention to, like the wolf warrior diplomacy, like the anti-poverty thing, and also technology development. So Xi Jinping, for whatever reason, has really grabbed onto this high-tech thing, AI, high-tech, smart cities, chip production. And so some of the local officials and SOE bosses have really played that up as a way to get Xi Jinping's attention. So you really, I guess one implication of that is also alarming for Hong Kong is that people will go out of their way. So Xi Jinping said, we have to stop all splittism in Hong Kong. These officials will go way out of the way to over comply with his wishes, often producing results that are really not good, not just for the recipients of these policies, but also for China as a whole.
We had a quick question came in about related to the Wolf War issue, but really on foreign relations. So maybe we'll touch that quickly, and then let's move back to a question on Hong Kong. This is the question. The follow-up, very quickly, if you could address, is from Hamsini. He says, we're seeing this aggressive posture on China's approach to South China Sea and India and the Indian border. So that's obviously been making news very recently. Is it a sign of behaviors to come? I thought it has arrived, but what do you think?
Yeah, the problem is, unless Xi Jinping himself fundamentally changes his mind, there is nothing in the system to stop him anymore, right? So if you ask diplomats or whatever privately in China, maybe they say, oh yeah, this is a terrible idea. Why are we, confronting the Indians? That's the last thing that China needs. But basically, obviously what's happening today happened because somehow Xi Jinping indicated that it should happen. And, certainly moving any troops in China now definitely requires the permission of Xi Jinping himself. So this is happening because of Xi. We know that for sure. And until he changes his mind, it will continue to happen. Now, of course, we don't know internally what his real wishes are, right? So is the wish to take territory slowly but surely? Is the ultimate objective to unsettle the Indian government somehow? So until we find that out, it's really unclear what's going to happen. But all we can say is that whatever is happening definitely is because he wished it so, and until he changes his mind, is not going to stop.
Okay, thank you. Just to switch back to Hong Kong again. There was a question, I apologize, I can't find his or her name at the moment. Well, no, unfortunately, that person showed us as Fred Tsai. Sorry to the original Fred Tsai. So the question was, the chairman of Hong Kong Exchange, Charles, said that the new security law will improve political stability of Hong Kong in the long term, which in turn will preserve its status as a financial center. What is your take on that? And then correlatedly, there was actually a question that on the potential outperformance of the Asia market, because China has recovered more strongly or earlier than say Hong Kong and the rest of the markets. What is your view on that? And then perhaps it would be a little bit greedy of me to, I think, throw in the question someone had asked, not a difficult question at all. When and how will the security law be implemented?
When
let's put that. When and how? If you
who
know,
knows?
surely.
No, well, so I answer that, try my best to answer it quickly, but I think there's some commentary about like how September was when they have to pass some kind of law. Let's just say that if my worst fears have come true, 1 year from now, Hong Kong will be very, very different because, and your reference point should be what happened to China, to mainland China after the communists took over. So you had a few years of pretty good united fronts, co-governing. This was when like the KMT party, the left KMT party was allowed to exist as an independent party. But then somewhere in 1955, 1956, all of these independent voices, civil society, were just systematically shut down one by one. And I think Dakota has a really nice book about that, about the bloody Frank Dakota, who's in Hong Kong, about this sort of bloody process of transforming mainland China into a socialist society. So something like that might happen. And I think given that, of course, the Chinese government has a lot of people in place already, some of them, many of them even in the Hong Kong police, they can make it happen pretty quickly. Months. So I would say months, not years. Okay, so the other questions. So is it going to be a safer investment environment? So first of all, despite all this protesting and rioting, Hang Seng was fine, at least no worse than the rest of the world. So this whole argument that, oh, protests on the street, affected the financial market in a substantial way is complete nonsense. It didn't really affect the financial market because investors just don't care about that. Investors care about the ability of H-share companies to, okay, fine. It affected, the commercial real estate stocks and all this kind of, but who cares about them? But a lot of the H-share listed companies are tech companies or mainland Chinese financial institutions or big industrial SOEs, mainland Chinese industrial SOEs. Those were not at all affected by the protests. The only shares, again, hit by the protests were Hong Kong-based retail service providers, whatever, like Meisum, like, and all that kind of stuff, like restaurant groups, commercial real estate. Who cares about those people? They're just Hong Kong tycoons, which the communists never cared about anyway. Not never. In the 80s they cared, but now they could care less. But the negative impact of the national security law will be quite substantial, I think, because investors now potentially will have no recourse. So again, the only way to assure investors is to implement a moderate version of the national security law in which you still preserve due process for all the offenders of the law in Hong Kong, and in which investors, any kind of economic related lawsuits will definitely not fall under the umbrella of the national security law. Somehow, so there has to be some kind of legal guarantees on that. Because otherwise investors will think that, geez, if I buy a security in Hong Kong, it will be just like if I was buying something in China, which, maybe the yields are attractive, but I will have no recourse and I will have to price that in terms of my allocation and in terms of the yields that I demand from these securities. Right now, it's a lot lower for Hong Kong issued securities because people generally believe they have recourse in Hong Kong. And of course, I believe the healthy functioning of the market requires people to short things. As being generally a bearish person myself, I like to short things. The ability of shorting things may be vastly curtailed in Hong Kong, which also will make Hong Kong a less desirable market. In terms of A-share performance, okay, so this is my comments about A-share and all the EM shares, right? So it's like, you would think that given how dismal the US has performed in COVID-19 in terms of controlling the disease, that US equity would have sold off like crazy. And it did in March, but it has basically regained almost all of the losses, which is, I find ridiculous, as someone who's shorting the US, basically. I find it ridiculous. But nonetheless, it's because the US dollar is a globally accepted and freely circulated currency. And when the US monetary authorities displayed a willingness and ability to massively ease in order to support the US economy, then equities came back. And so far, China has not been willing or maybe able to do that. There's some discussion of trying to do that in China, but the PBOC is really afraid that if they were to massively print money, just like the US, then some of it will leak out of China, thus depleting the foreign exchange reserve. So the fact that the renminbi is not a freely circulating currency and freely tradable currency, really it turns out to be a weakness in terms of China's desire to be a dominant country in the world, right? So I would argue that until the renminbi can be freely traded, China really cannot achieve this dominance that it so desires, from the US.
Well, I think Sir John Templeton once said that the four most dangerous words in investing are "this time it's different." So there you go. Okay, we have I think a few questions that kind of are trickling through, but I just want to actually, so let's if you could just address them very, very quickly, Victor. When China, so this is from Igor in Beijing. I think we have quite a few Yenqing scholars in YCW because we have YCW team members in Yenqing. So he asked if you could comment when China might reopen its borders and if those diplomatic tensions, which we've discussed earlier, could affect immigration after air travel to mainland resumes. So I suppose it kind of speaks to
into China or Chinese immigrating to the US.
If it's about China reopening its borders, I suppose perhaps immigration is the wrong word. Maybe it's I think people going to China.
Going to China.
Going to China. Well, you've said so yourself.
Yeah, no, I hope to go to China. Yeah. Basically, I think it depends on the number of COVID cases in these countries. The local leaders are really afraid that transmission from a foreign country is going to start, another wave of infection at the local area because they would be seen as derelict of duty. And so I think China would be very careful with countries with a high number of cases for the foreseeable future, including the US, but also Latin American countries, Russia. Maybe some of the European countries will relax, actually, in the next few months, but we'll see.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask one last question, mostly because Victor and I talked about this when we were prepping for today's meeting. Which I hope everyone really enjoyed today. If you have nice things to say to Victor, please write them in the chat. If you don't have nice things to say to him, you can send it to me. But I know you can find his email on the internet, and then you can follow up with your own pressing questions.
Yes.
But Victor, you're working on a new book, Coalition of the Willing. No, sorry, no.
No, not the willing. Yeah, that's the UN.
Just kidding. Can you tell us a little bit more about the new book?
Yeah, sure. So it's called Coalitions of the Weak. It's mainly about the late Mao period. So what people typically know about the late Mao period is that, of course, Mao purged a lot of his contemporaries, the revolutionaries like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping and Lin Biao, they were purged. But there has not been a systematic study of who replaced these people, who are the beneficiaries of the late Mao period. And what I argue is that in order to have a long-lasting, stable dictatorship, what Mao did was to replace anyone who could threaten him with a bunch of people who could never threaten him. And those people included a bunch of generals who literally betrayed the party in the 1930s, and they were all labeled as counter-revolutionary splittists. And so they were very vulnerable to Chairman Mao's attack. So they were actually benefited during the Cultural Revolution because Mao did not fear these people. Mao was not afraid that these generals was going to challenge his power. So they got promoted. The other group that benefited were these writers, propaganda writers, who helped Mao launch the Cultural Revolution, but they didn't have a wide network within the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore they also could not challenge Mao's power. So after the death of Lin Biao in 1971, you basically had these two groups of people occupying most of the senior level positions in the Chinese Communist Party, and that was the secret as to how Mao was able to rule pretty peacefully, I would argue, until he died in 1976. And now if Xi Jinping wants to be a lifetime dictator, which it looks like he does want to, I think he will have an incentive to pursue a similar policy of promoting officials with very narrow networks within the regime. So either technocrats who've always worked in one ministry or one SOE, or sometimes it could be provincial officials who've always been in one province, or if they've been in multiple provinces, they have some kind of weakness attached to them, either because they're ethnic minorities, which we are seeing some cases of that, you know, Bai Yin Chaolu and people like that, or they have some kind of, Xi Jinping has some kind of dirt on these people because of corruption or something like that. And the other implication is that no one else will be able to build up a power base within the party besides Xi Jinping himself. He's going to be extremely suspicious, and you know, anyone who tries to build up a power base will lend themselves to being purged by Xi. So I think this will make for you know, in a way boring, but still interesting to watch kind of political dynamics, especially after the 20th Party Congress in 2022.
Takeaways from that for us at the present moment?
Takeaway from, well, the book won't come out for quite some time because it's academic publishing. So unfortunately, by my current book, which is called Economic Shocks and Authoritarian Stability, that is available. It's a collection of essays, not just by me, but by a whole bunch of top political scientists as they think about how economic shocks affect stability in authoritarian regimes in a comparative context. The takeaway for that book is that just because there's a big global recession doesn't mean that these authoritarian leaders are going to fall from power. One of the big strengths of authoritarian regimes is that they can reshuffle their coalition very flexibly, right? So, you know, one day they have actor A, B, and C supporting them in power, but if the resources suddenly shrinks, they can get rid of actor A and just keep B and C, or they can even find new allies. And this is the way in which authoritarian leaders around the world have stayed in power during economic crises. They're not always successful, but at least in the majority of cases that we looked at, it has been successful. So it's not going to be as easy as like, oh, you know, if oil prices fall, then we're going to see a new wave of democratization. We're not seeing that. It takes sort of more than that, I think.
Sorry. Thank you. So simple stuff, right? I mean, easy to resolve,
Simple
that kind
stuff.
of thing. And Sam, maybe what we can do, as I said before, we're actually going to repackage this into a podcast that a global editor, Sam, will be putting out. Perhaps, Sam, we could include the links to the books that Victor has mentioned, including his early ones on factions of in financial
Actions in
reforms.
finance. Yeah.
Sorry, that was,
Okay.
that was a bit of a limerick. Sorry. So I want to thank Victor very, very much, and to everybody. I do just want to give a heads up that I know it's been COVID. I know it's not great sitting in your pajamas with an office top, you know, day in and day out. But I'm very proud of our organization, YCW, for really rallying together. The YCW London chapter has introduced a climate change series all of June, talking about food security in China, China's role in climate change, and obviously inevitably about COVID management. And our New York and DC chapters are going to be launching another series for June as well, called China, the World, and the COVID Story, How We Got Here and What Lies Ahead. It's in collaboration with New Voices and the Chinese Storytellers. That's going to come out soon, and I'm just so excited. And to know that this is an open webinar, you know, pretty much anyone can join. We actually had someone from London write to this chat and said, why are you saying good morning and good evening because it's the middle of the night for me. So this is your draw, Victor, that someone's coming at 2, 3 in the morning to do that. And I'm also very proud to say that YCW introduced this thing called a pulse survey, literally a pulse check on sentiments amongst our community. And we've got the new results coming out pretty soon, in another week or two. So please, keep in touch by signing up, and we'll be sending out notes. And if you have any ideas of what topics you want to cover, who you want to speak to, please just write us directly. So Victor, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
setting the tone, keeping us a little bit depressed, but also optimistic, perhaps, fingers crossed, as we navigate the next few days.
All
Thanks,
right.
Victor.
Thank you for
Thanks,
having
everyone.
me.
Have a good
Yep.
Sunday.
Bye.